Selling my father's prized Harley was the only way to save his life. What I didn't expect was for his old motorcycle club, the Desert Vultures, to show up on our doorstep asking where it went. The sound I hated most in the world was the quiet hiss and gurgle of the oxygen machine. It was a constant wheezing reminder in the corner of our small living room, the soundtrack to my father's slow fade. Dad was my whole world. He was a giant of a man, or he had been, before the sickness in his lungs took root. Years of breathing in dust at the quarry had carved him down, leaving a frail man who fought for every breath. And the medicine that kept the worst of it at bay, the inhalers and pills that let him sleep through the night without choking, cost more than my part-time diner job could ever cover. The bills were a quiet monster, multiplying on the kitchen counter while we slept. That's why I was in the garage, staring at the only other thing my dad loved as much as me, his Harley. It wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a 1998 Heritage Softail Classic, a gleaming beast of black and chrome that he called Sadie. Sadie was his freedom. Every inch of her was polished, every bit of leather conditioned. He couldn't ride her anymore, not with his lungs, but some afternoons he'd have me wheel her out into the sun. He'd just sit on a stool beside her, running a cloth over the fuel tank, the scent of wax and old leather filling the air. He'd tell me stories of rides he took before I was born, of winding roads and brotherhoods forged on two wheels. His old club, the Desert Vultures, had disbanded years ago, scattered to the winds by jobs and families, but the memories were etched into Sadie's chrome as surely as his reflection. The pharmacy had called that morning. The refill for his primary medication was ready. The cost was $742. I had $112 in my pocket. The math was a punch to the gut. I'd looked at my dad, sleeping in his armchair, his chest rattling with each shallow breath, and I knew there was no other choice. It felt like a betrayal, like cutting out a piece of his soul. But his soul was no good to me if his body gave out. My hands trembled as I took the photos for the online ad. I made sure the light caught the chrome just right, the way he liked it. I priced it low, stupidly low, because I needed the cash fast. Needs to go today, I typed, my vision blurring with tears. Cash only. Within an hour, a man named Rick replied. His profile picture was a blurry shot of a bulldog. His messages were blunt. $5K cash. I can be there in 2 hours. It was less than half of what Sadie was worth. A sickening, predatory offer. But it was more than enough for the medicine, with some left over for the next few bills. I looked at the oxygen machine, listened to its rhythmic hiss, and typed back, "Okay." Rick was exactly what I expected. A big, greasy man with a stained t-shirt and a wallet on a chain. He circled Sadie like a vulture, pointing out imaginary flaws, trying to haggle me down even further. I stood my ground, my voice shaking but firm. 5,000, that was the price. He grunted, pulled a messy wad of cash from his pocket, and counted it out onto the workbench. The bills were crumpled and smelled faintly of cheap beer. He didn't even seem to appreciate her. He just saw a quick flip. As he clumsily wheeled her down the driveway and loaded her onto a rickety trailer, a piece of my heart went with her. I didn't watch him leave. I just closed the garage door on the empty space, the ghost of her oil and leather scent already fading. For 3 days, a fragile peace settled over the house. I paid for the medicine, and I could already see a change in my dad. The rattle in his chest was softer, his color a little better. He hadn't even noticed Sadie was gone, confined as he was to the house. I'd tell him she was at a friend's shop for a tune-up, a lie that tasted like ash in my mouth every time I practiced it. I'd just have to keep the lie going until... well, I hadn't figured that part out yet. It was a Thursday afternoon when the sound started. At first it was just a low rumble, like distant thunder on a clear day. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, trying to ignore the gnawing guilt. But the rumble didn't fade. It grew, deepening into a guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of 1 Harley, then 2, then 10. It was the sound of an army. I dropped the plate I was holding, and it shattered in the sink. My heart hammered against my ribs. I crept to the living room window, pulling back the edge of the curtain. My blood ran cold. It wasn't an army. It was a pack. Dozens of motorcycles, a sea of chrome and black leather, were flooding our quiet suburban street. They moved with a terrifying, organized precision, parking in a staggered formation that blocked the entire road. Men, huge and weathered, dismounted. On the back of every single leather vest was the same patch, a snarling wolf's skull, encircled by the words, "Desert Vultures, MC." My breath caught in my throat. This was my dad's old club. But these weren't the smiling men from his old photos. These men looked hard, their faces set like stone. They formed a silent, intimidating wall in front of our house, their collective gaze fixed on our front door. Then, one of them, a mountain of a man with a long gray beard and tattoos that snaked up his neck, stepped forward. He walked slowly up our pathway, his heavy boots echoing in the sudden, dead silence of the neighborhood. He stopped on our porch, his shadow falling over the welcome mat. He raised a hand, big as a cinder block, and knocked. The sound boomed through the small house, each knock a hammer blow against my terrified heart. My heart was a hummingbird trapped in my ribs. Behind me I heard my dad stir in his armchair. "Maya!" "What was that noise?" he rasped, his voice thin and papery. I couldn't answer. I couldn't breathe. The man on the porch just stood there waiting, his presence filling the entire world. I knew if I didn't open the door, he would simply remove it. Taking a shuddering breath, I turned the lock and pulled the door open just a crack, trying to shield the living room from view. "Can I help you?" My voice came out as a squeak. The giant on the porch looked down at me. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, but his eyes were surprisingly clear, the color of a winter sky. "We're looking for Deacon," he said, his voice a low rumble, like gravel turning in a cement mixer. Deacon. That was my dad's road name. No one had called him that in years. "This is his house, isn't it?" He's not feeling well," I stammered, my hand trembling on the doorknob. "He's sleeping." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked past me towards the garage. "We heard his bike was for sale. We just wanted to make sure everything was all right." The lie I'd practiced caught in my throat. This wasn't some nosy neighbor. This man could smell a lie from a mile away. No, she's not for sale. Sadie's just at a friend's shop, getting a tune-up." A flicker of something not amusement, but a grim certainty passed over his face. He leaned against the doorframe, and the house seemed to groan under his weight. "That's funny," he rumbled, "because a piece of filth named Rick tried to sell a '98 Heritage Softdale to a prospect from another charter this morning, a bike that looked a hell of a lot like Sadie. He said he got it for a song from some desperate kid." He let the words hang in the air, each one a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just about the bike. It was about honor, about territory. I had, in my ignorance, thrown a lit match into a powder keg. "Who's at the door, Maya?" My dad's voice was stronger this time, closer. He was trying to get up. Panic clawed at me. He couldn't see this. The shock could kill him. "It's nobody, Dad. Just go back to sleep," I hissed, trying to push the door closed, but the man's boot was suddenly in the way. "Deacon," he called out, his voice easily cutting through the thin walls of our house. "Deacon, it's Bear." There was a sharp intake of breath from the living room, followed by a series of racking coughs. The man-bear pushed the door open. He didn't shove it, he just moved, and I was forced to stumble back. He filled the doorway, and behind him, the rest of the club stood silent and watchful, a jury of giants. Bear's gaze swept the room, taking in the worn-out furniture, the stacks of medical bills on the counter, and finally, my father. Dad had managed to pull himself to his feet, one hand braced on the arm of his chair, the other clutching the clear plastic tube that fed him oxygen. He was a scarecrow in a faded flannel shirt, a ghost of the man Bear must have remembered. The hard lines on Bear's face seemed to melt, replaced by a profound, gut-wrenching shock. The air in the room crackled with a heavy, sorrowful silence. "Bear," my dad whispered, a fragile, disbelieving smile touching his lips. "You old son of a gun. What in the hell are you doing here?" Bear didn't smile back. He didn't seem to be looking at my dad anymore. His eyes were fixed on the hissing oxygen concentrator. Then they flickered to the prescription bottles lined up on the end table. Then they landed on me. He saw it all in an instant, the sickness, the poverty, the desperation. The pieces clicked into place with an audible snap. The fury that returned to his face was 100 times more terrifying than the cold anger he'd shown on the porch. It wasn't just about a stolen bike anymore. This was about family. This was about a brother left to suffer in silence. He turned his head slightly, never taking his eyes off me, and spoke to the men assembled on the lawn. His voice was no longer a rumble. It was a blade of sheer ice. Spike, Cutter, find Rick. I want him, and I want the bike. Don't call me until you have both. 2 of the bikers immediately broke from the pack, swinging their legs over their bikes with an efficient, deadly grace. The engines roared to life, shattering the stillness, and then they were gone. Bear turned his full attention back to me. He took a deliberate step into our living room, his presence sucking all the air out. My dad looked on, confused and weak. Bear looked right through him, his gaze locked on mine. "You," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're going to tell me exactly what's been going on here, and you're not going to leave out a single damn detail." I couldn't speak. The words were a tangled knot of shame and fear in my throat. My dad, bewildered, took a shuffling step forward. "Bear, what's this about? Maya, what have you done?" His voice was full of a weak, fluttering confusion that broke my heart all over again. Bear held up a hand, a gesture that was somehow both gentle and an absolute command, stopping my dad in his tracks. "Easy, Deacon. Just sit. We'll sort it." Then his winter sky eyes were back on me, pinning me to the wall. The rest of the club remained outside, a silent, leathery honor guard. They were waiting for their president's signal. My story came out in a torrent of choked sobs and whispered explanations. I told him everything. The quarry dust, the diagnosis, the mountain of debt that grew higher every month. I told him about the sleepless nights spent listening to Dad's struggle for breath, the soul-crushing choice between electricity and medication, the quiet terror of watching my hero waste away. As I spoke, I could see the hardness in Bear's face calcifying, turning into something granite-like and immovable. He wasn't looking at a scared teenager. He was looking at a symptom of a world that had let his brother down. When I finally got to the part about selling Sadie, my voice broke completely. "I had to," I whispered, tears tracking hot paths down my cheeks. "The pharmacy wouldn't give me a refill without the money. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know who to call." "You could have called us," Bear said, and the quiet simplicity of the statement was a physical blow. "Deacon has your number, doesn't he?" My dad sank back into his chair, his face ashen. I didn't want to be a burden," he mumbled, looking at his hands. "You all have lives, families. This is my fight." "The hell it is," Bear growled, whirling on him. The sudden volcanic anger in his voice made me flinch. "A burden? We're vultures, Deacon. This patch," he jabbed a thumb at the snarling skull on his vest. "It means something. It means we don't let a brother go down. Not for money, not for sickness, not for anything. You got that?" My dad just stared, his eyes wide and glassy. He hadn't heard that fire, that unwavering loyalty, in years. He'd forgotten what it felt like to have a pack at his back. Bear took a deep, calming breath, reining in his temper. He looked around the room again, his gaze lingering on the threadbare carpet and the peeling paint. He pulled out his phone, his massive thumbs tapping out a quick message. Within a minute, men started moving. It was a silent, well-oiled invasion. 2 bikers came inside, their boots loud on the linoleum. They didn't say a word to me. One, a wiry man with a face like a road map, walked straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and just stood there, his expression turning grimmer by the second. The other headed for my dad. "Doc's on his way, Deacon," he said softly. "He's our guy, best in the state. He's going to take a look at you." My dad tried to protest, but the biker just shook his head. Outside, more men were dismounting, pulling tool bags and equipment from their saddlebags. A generator rumbled to life. Someone was at the breaker box on the side of the house. This was more than just getting a bike back. They were taking over. They were fixing what was broken, and that included everything. An hour later, Our small house was a hive of activity. The man from the kitchen, whose name I learned was Slim, had returned with 4 bags of groceries and was now cooking something that smelled like heaven. Doc turned out to be a grizzled, retired Army medic with a vulture's patch sewn onto his medical bag. He was checking my dad's vitals, asking sharp, precise questions with a gentleness that defied his appearance. Another group of men was in the backyard, working on what sounded suspiciously like building a wheelchair ramp. No one asked me for permission. They just saw a need and filled it. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and in a way I couldn't yet understand, it was beautiful. Bear had been on his phone in the corner, his voice a low, commanding murmur. Finally, he hung up and walked over to me. I was huddled on the stairs, feeling like a ghost in my own home. "Spike and Cutter found him," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The guy, Rick. He was at a pawn shop, trying to get papers forged for Sadie." He paused and his eyes locked onto mine. "They've got the bike. They're bringing it back. But they have Rick, too." My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. I pictured the greasy, arrogant man who had lowballed me, who had treated my dad's legacy like a piece of scrap metal. What are you going to do to him?" I whispered. Bear looked out the front door, at the long shadows stretching across the lawn. His expression was unreadable, as hard and ancient as a mountain face. "The vultures have a simple code, kid. We protect our own, and we deal with those who try to prey on them." He looked back at me, and a chill went down my spine. He made the mistake of showing disrespect. Not just to the club, but to family. He's going to return what he took. And then, he's going to pay for it. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Before I could process their full, terrifying weight, a new sound cut through the evening air. 2 distinct engine notes growing louder, angrier. Spike and Cutter were back. Every vulture on my lawn seemed to straighten up, their attention shifting to the end of the street. A rusty pickup truck pulling a rickety trailer turned the corner, flanked on either side by the 2 bikers, herding it like wolves herding a sick sheep. They guided it to a stop directly in front of our house, the truck's engine sputtering out with a pathetic cough. The driver's side door was shoved open, and Rick was hauled out. He looked nothing like the smug predator who had been in my garage 3 days ago. His face was pale, his stained t-shirt was drenched in sweat, and his eyes were wide with a primal fear I had never seen in a grown man. Spike and Cutter had him by the arms, their grips like iron clamps. They marched him up the lawn and stopped him in front of Bear, who hadn't moved an inch from his spot in my living room doorway. "He had this," Spike said, tossing Rick's greasy, chain-linked wallet onto our porch steps. $5,000 inside. Bear didn't even look at the wallet. His eyes were locked on Rick. "Unload the bike," he commanded, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of a judge pronouncing a sentence. Shaking, Rick was practically frog-marched to the back of the trailer. With clumsy, terrified hands, he unstrapped Sadie and wheeled her down the ramp. My heart ached as I saw her. He hadn't even covered her. A thin layer of road dust dulled her perfect black paint. He pushed her onto the driveway, stopping a few feet from the porch. "The money you stole," Bear said, his voice dropping another 10 degrees. "Put it on the seat." Rick fumbled with the wallet, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the bills out. He pulled out the crumpled wad of cash and placed it carefully on Sadie's leather seat. "Now the rest," Bear said. Rick stared, uncomprehending. The rest of what?" "The rest of your money," Bear clarified, as if speaking to a particularly stupid child. "For the disrespect, for trying to profit from my brother's sickness, for making his little girl think this was her only option. Empty your pockets." "All of them." A whimper escaped Rick's lips. He slowly, painstakingly, pulled out another smaller wad of cash from his back pocket and a few loose bills from the front. He placed it all on the seat next to the original 5,000. "Good," Bear said. "Now get in your truck and leave." A flicker of disbelief, of hope, crossed Rick's face. He started to scramble towards his truck, but Bear wasn't finished. "Leave the keys," he added. "And the title, in the truck. That's for the trouble of having to hunt you down. Consider it a lesson. We take care of our own. Now walk away and don't ever let us see your face in this state again." Rick stared at his truck. then at the wall of impassive leather-clad giants surrounding him, and he understood. He dropped the keys on the driver's seat, threw the title on the dash, and then he turned and practically ran down the street, not looking back once. Silence descended. Then Bear bent down, picked up the wad of cash from Sadie's seat, and walked into the house. He went straight to my father, who was watching the entire scene with a mixture of awe and horror. Bear took my father's hand, opened it, and pressed the cash into his palm. "This is yours, Deacon. It's always been yours." Tears welled in my father's eyes. He looked from the money to Sadie, gleaming under the porch light, and then to me. The shame that had been a constant weight on my shoulders finally began to lift, replaced by the warmth of his understanding gaze. He knew why I'd done it. The rest of the evening was a blur of controlled, purposeful kindness. Slim served up massive plates of stew. Doc gave me a list of my dad's new appointments, all with specialists he knew, all taken care of. Spike and Cutter hot-wired Rick's truck, drove it a few blocks away, and left it with the keys in it, giving him a chance to get it before it was impounded. It wasn't about theft. It was about making a point. By the time they were ready to leave, the new wheelchair ramp was finished, our fridge was full, and a lockbox with several $1,000s, a club donation, sat on the kitchen table. Bear was the last to go. He stood on the porch with my dad and me. The roar of engines had been replaced by a low, contented idle as the pack waited for him. Dad was leaning against the doorframe, looking stronger than he had in years. "I don't know how to thank you, Bear," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Bear just clapped him on the shoulder. "You don't have to. Just get better. And call us next time. Pride's no good if it kills you." He then turned to me. The hard lines of his face softened for the first time. "You've got guts, kid. You did what you had to do for your family. That's a vulture move. You're one of us now, you understand." I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. He walked down the steps and swung a leg over his own massive bike. With a final nod, he fired up the engine, and the sound joined the chorus. The pack pulled away, a rumbling, thundering wave of chrome and leather that wasn't frightening anymore. It was the sound of protection, the sound of family. I stood there with my dad, his arm around my shoulder, and we watched until the last taillight disappeared. The quiet that settled over our street was different now. It wasn't the silence of sickness and desperation anymore. It was peace. The hiss of the oxygen machine was still there, but for the first time in a very long time, it wasn't the only sound I could hear. I could still hear the rumble of Sadie's brothers, a promise echoing in the night.